Hello, it's me, Steve, your instructor again. And today I'm going to give you a lecture on our next reading assignment, which is the basis for your critical essay that's worth 20% of your grade. So we'll get started with that in a minute, but before that I've been reading up on online instruction, and one of the things I've come across that appealed to me was it says it's good to add a personal touch. So I'd like you to meet my cat, whose name is Baby, and who's 8 or maybe 16 or maybe 20 years old, and is a rescue and is doing very well in her new household. And she says hello to you. So that's my cat. And now I'd like to get on with the lecture, but before we do, I hope you'll give me some feedback and let me know how well it works for you. And if it doesn't, especially what I could do to make it better insofar as you can take the time and energy to suggest that to me. So let's try it and let me know how it works, okay? Hello. We're going to learn something about doing basic research, as well as find out about the essay you're going to be writing your critical paper on. To start, though, I want to introduce you to the research process that the Modern Language Association, or MLA, prescribes. You'll know MLA from the MLA format of your new drafts, and now we're going to learn how MLA documents sources. A source, by definition, is any text that might be a video or a personal conversation, but more likely to be a document, a web document or a paper document, from which you take information to include in something you're writing. There's 3 ways to take this information. You can either quote it directly, put in quotation marks exactly what the person said. You can paraphrase it, put it in your own words. Or you can summarize it, which means to take a large block of what that person had to say and then summarize it briefly in your own words. Anytime you do any of those things, you need to put what's called an in-text citation, a set of parentheses with the author's name in it, and a page number if the source has pages. And that leads your reader to the works cited page, the last page or pages of your paper, on which they find those sources listed in the works cited entries, listed in the in-text citations, listed in alphabetical order by the word in the in-text citation. Let's look first at the information we need to gather on a source in order to enable the reader to find that source. And if you look at the page in front of you, you'll see that certain things have been checked off, both on the left-hand page, which is the title page of the book, and on the right-hand page, which is the publication history of the book. And that would usually be on the back of the title page. The title we see checked first, upper left. We don't need the subtitle. Then we see the edition is the 8th edition, the names of the editors in order from senior to junior editors, the person in charge, the person under them, the person at the bottom. Below that, we see the name of the publishing house and the city where it was published. We always take the first one. And if we go back to the publication history, we get one more important piece of information, which is the date, the copyright date. And we take the most recent one, which here is 2010. Now, if we go on to the next page, we see that this is a website called Nightsite. And on Nightsite, you find the way to create an MLA formatted works cited entry for any type of document. And all the different types of documents are listed on that gold stripe down the left side of the page. Notice that MLA is highlighted at the very top under citation styles in that stripe. And then we have types of resources. A book, which means a book by a single author. An anthology, which is a group of writings by different authors that are pulled together by an editor or editors, which is what we're reading now. And you'll see author and editor is highlighted there, which is what we want to use. It might be a periodical, something that's published on a regular cycle, weekly or monthly or quarterly or daily. And multimedia, let's not worry too much about, nor communication. We can use all of these if it comes up. But mainly the source you're going to be using is down at the bottom, online only. And it's going to be the first one underneath there. Entire website. When you have an entire website, you're going to list that as a source, and by checking that in the left-hand column, you're going to create a works cited entry in proper MLA format. Today we're going to do that for a book, but also understand web page underneath that. Web page or blog post is something that you're going to use quite often too in order to list a page on a website that has specific information. This would, for instance, include a blog post, as they say, but also most any one of the links that you get to from Wikipedia. Now, you can't use Wikipedia because it's not a reliable source, but you can use sources that are linked on Wikipedia, and each of those will probably be a web page if there's a link. Some of them are print sources, but that's getting less and less frequent. Let's take a look now at how we take the information that's on the first page, the title page, and the publication history page of Rereading America, and let's see how that fits in to Night Sight's fields, which are on the right in black on white. And we fill in these fields, as many as we can, and if there's a field we can't fill in, we leave it blank, and Night Sight takes care of that. There's one author. His name is Michael Kimmel. Go down the page with me as I read. He has no middle initial, so we leave that blank. We put the title of the original work, which is Bros Before Hoes, the Guy Code. And note, he doesn't want to be the person who says Bros Before Hoes, so he puts it in single quotes here, because the whole article title is going to be put in double quotes, and we use single quotes inside double quotes. Next, we see it's the 8th edition from the previous page. There's only one volume, so it's one of one. There are 3 editors, and we'll list their names, all without middle initials. And then we have the title of the book, Rereading America. And below that, we indicate that we want to cite the author, Michael Kimmel. So the first word in this works cited entry is going to be Kimmel. The publisher, which we got off the title page. The publishing city, MLA wants it. The year published, we got the latest copyright date, 2010. And does it have pages? Yes. It has pages 608 to 615. And what kind of source is it? We check off print source. And then we submit it, and we get our works cited entry, which we find on the next page. Before we go to Kimmel's essay, let's take a look at the works cited entry. Notice some strange things about it. First of all, the name Kimmel is out at the margin, but the next line is indented as if it were a paragraph. Those first words, because they're the way we alphabetize these entries when there's more than one, are stuck out to the margin so we can look quickly down the margin and find the alphabetized item we want, which we got from the in-text citation. And here we see it's Kimmel, comma, Michael. We use the author's last name first, then put a period. Open quotes, then a single quote around Bros Before Hoes. just like we put in the field. And then the guy code, and the whole thing is Kimmel's title, so that goes in quotation marks, which is how we mark the title of a short work. It's volume 1, and the title of the book is Rereading America, which is in italics, or underlining if you prefer, which is how we show the title of a long work that contains those short works whose titles are in quotes inside it. We have the editors, we have the 8th edition, we have Boston, Bedford St. Martin's, and then date, and in the first volume, which is the only one, it's pages 608 to 15. Going below that, you'll notice there's a page number in red. We're on page 608 of Rereading America, but if you were in language awareness, you'd be on page 477. And then over on the right, on page 609, where you see the number 478, that, and if you look at the caret at the beginning of the paragraph, the little right-hand arrow, that's where the page would break. And the pages are marked that way from language awareness to Rereading America, all through the text. I'm going to go through the text, but let's pause and go back and review the other items that we've talked about, especially the information we want from the title page, which is also on websites and web pages, though there's a different way to find it, usually by scrolling down to the bottom. How Night Sight looks, because you're going to be using it for the exercise, and what we are looking for in a works cited entry. Certain order of information, a particular kind of indentation, and enough information that the reader can find the text that we're using as a source. Let's pause and take it from there. Now I know that's a lot of information so far, and we haven't even gotten to talking about the essay yet, which I'm going to do now. But before I do, I wanted to talk to you about the textbook. As I think you can see, I'm able to supply most of the reading text, the essays, from online sources. The trouble is that's not the most important thing in the textbook. The most important thing in the textbook is the workbook sections, especially the one on writing with sources that you're assigned for this week. What I'm hoping is that you will be able to get the textbook and work from it, because if you don't, you're going to miss the benefit of a great deal of information that's absolutely essential to the course. That said, let's get on to Kimmel's essay, and we'll revisit this problem as needs be, individually if you like. Feel free to get in touch with me about this. There used to be books on the Library in Reserve, but Library Reserve doesn't operate electronically. So again, we're faced with the limitations of our situation. Anyway, for now, I'd like you to go back and try the exercise and documentation, and then come back to this video when you're ready to talk more about the essay and your upcoming assignment. See you then. Here we are back at Kimmel's essay. By now, you should have read the essay itself, either the clean or the annotated copy, whichever one you prefer, as well as the section in the textbook called Writing with Sources, which runs roughly from pages 43 through 58, including a sample student essay. In this first draft, we're not going to worry about the in-text citations. We're just going to try and get the works cited page together, though the bonus exercise for this week does offer you a chance to start working on in-text citations. And if you know about them or feel you understand them, then it's certainly okay to try them in this first draft of your essay you're going to be doing on Kimmel's Bros Before Hoes, the Guy Code. In this essay, Kimmel develops a thesis which is not at all clear throughout the whole essay. Something you'll find in many professional essays is that the thesis turns up at the end after all the evidence has been presented. So let's go to the end of the essay and see if we can find that thesis, which probably won't be that hard because it says thesis with a big exclamation point after it. And his point then, the argumentative point that he's trying to prove, which is what we mean by a thesis, that of which the writer is trying to convince the reader, is that masculinity is coerced and policed relentlessly by other guys. His further point is that it is socially rather than biologically determined that men behave in the way they do. Keep that in mind as we go through the essay from the beginning and try to understand how everything fits into this idea of men being coerced by social rather than biological forces, because that's his main idea. And everything he says is about that coercion. One thing I'd like to suggest to you, though by no means is it a demand or a requirement, is that you think of starting your essay with what we call an embedded quote, a quote from the text that's part of a sentence that you write. If you look at the introductory blurb in italics between Michael Kimmel's name and the beginning of the actual text in Roman type, which is what we call type that's not italic, you'll see in the middle of it there's a sentence. Kimmel, born 1951, has written or edited more than a dozen books on men and masculinity. That phrase is quite enough to bring the reader's attention to who Kimmel is and to start out your essay before you begin to talk about the essay itself, just a little bit about the author. So you could write a sentence like, the author of Bros Before Hoes, the Guy Code, comma, Michael Kimmel, comma, and then open quotes and just take that phrase, has written or edited more than a dozen books on men and masculinity. Period. Close quotes. Now you can go on to talk about the essay since you've told the reader who Kimmel is. In his essay, Kimmel, and then you just go with it, especially in the way that we're talking about, first summarizing, then analyzing, then criticizing. And how you analyze and how you criticize is laid out in the assignment sheet for the critical essay. What I'm going to talk about in this lecture is how the essay is structured and where you might find important points from it and where you might find quotable sections of it. And those are all marked in my marginal notations. So let's now take a look at the text and see what we can find that we might be able to use. Now, Kimmel opens with a kind of general storytelling that is not what we've learned to call storytelling, but rather a general recollection about something that's happened to him over a period of time that he summarizes. And it has to do with the difference between how men and women answer a particular question about what it means to belong to their gender. Women's answers tend to be very broad and universal and take in any number of possibilities, but the phrase "be a man," in fact, has very narrow meanings to men, which relate directly to Kimmel's idea of how men's aspirations and development and behavior is restricted to a narrow idea of what being a man is. And based on this difference in expectations, he comes up with a list starting now on page 609, where he summarizes all the ideas that he's gotten from asking men this question. I'm not saying you should use that list or quote it, but right underneath it, if you wanted to say something, for instance, like, Kimmel presents a list of responses men have made about what it means to be a real man. And what he says about it is, quote, the unifying emotional subtext of all these aphorisms involves never showing emotions or admitting to weakness. And that's the line in the text right after the list. And that's what I call your first quote. It's something you could embed in the text and quote that Kimmel says that summarizes everything that went before it. If we go down a little further, we come to a crucial definition because it brings up a term that's in the title, the Guy Code. And the next sentence you could write, or some sentences after that when you've discussed more about what Kimmel has to say, is Kimmel introduces the idea of a Guy Code, comma, open quotes, the collection of attitudes, values, and traits that together composes what it means to be a man. You could end the quote there, or you could go on to the next sentence. These are the rules that govern behavior in Guyland. Brings up another important point of Kimmel's. The criteria that we use to evaluate whether any particular guy measures up. It's an important definition, and you might use that as your second quote, though by no means do you have to. Now, in the next paragraph, Kimmel brings in one of his sources, the psychologist Robert Brannon. And Robert Brannon brings up 4 more points in which he summarizes the idea of the Guy Code in a slightly different way than Kimmel does. And here, if we're going to talk about these, we might want to say Kimmel introduces the work of the psychologist Robert Brannon, who summarizes 4 rules of masculinity, and then you could quote, no sissy stuff, and then going on to the next page, which we'll do now, comma, be a big wheel, each of these phrases separately in quotes, comma, be a sturdy oak, and give him hell. And there we've quoted Brannon, who himself is quoted by Kimmel. And now we're on page 610 with the cartoon, which is kind of stupid, but perhaps amusing. I don't know. Now what we want to do, having gotten through Kimmel's introduction, we're on page 611 looking at the first subheading, being a man among men. And here we want to say, quoting the actual title of the section, in, quote, being a man among men, unquote, Kimmel brings up more points about the narrowing requirements of masculinity. And now we can quote the third quote, which going down the page you'll see in the margin. He says of the influences that men endure, quote, guys hear the voices of the men in their lives, fathers, coaches, brothers, grandfathers, uncles, priests, to inform their ideas of masculinity. Excuse me. And going further, especially if you want to get into this area, though you're welcome to leave it out too, Kimmel goes into the area of how men relate to women and how their idea of their own success as men connects with women. And what he mainly says is that what women think are irrelevant. That is, quote, they, men, want to be positively evaluated by other men. And then going down to the next section in brackets, masculinity is largely a homosocial experience performed and judged by other men. And a little further, if you want to get into it, and you could join this all, each of these quotes, by 3 dots, showing that there's text intervening between, but you're leaving it out. It's called an ellipsis, which means something left out. The final one, which is quite striking, women often become a kind of currency by which men negotiate their status with other men. Women are for possessing, not for emulating. Men don't act like women. They try to act like other men. And as I say, this section about their relation to women is not central to the text or to your analysis of it. If it interests you, though, you might want to include it. Let's go on to the next page and see what else turns up. And we come to a new subheading where Kimmel introduces the key concept for him, the gender police, where he talks about how men, and here we get to the 5th quote, become relentless cowboys, riding the fences, checking the boundary line between masculinity and femininity, making sure nothing slips over. And of course, we want to say here, probably in our own words, who are the gender police? And the gender police are those other men that Kimmel introduced in the earlier quote. Coaches, fathers, priests, all those things that he talked about. And a little further down, where it says details in the margin, we see another quote. Our efforts to maintain a manly front cover everything we do, what we wear, how we talk, how we walk, what we eat, like the recent flap over man-witches, those artery-clogging massive burgers dripping with extra. That part in parentheses doesn't really have to go there. You could replace it with an ellipsis. Every mannerism, every movement contains a coded gender language. And that quote, without that central part, could work quite well. Worked again into your text, embedded in what you have to say. And then we get further down, and we get a list of what we have learned from our previous studies are called lexical attacks, individual words that demean and at the same time energize in a bad way men when they are called these names, make them want to fight or be ashamed or bring about some emotional and maybe behavioral reaction. Wimp, faggot, dork, pussy, loser was nerd, queer, homo girl, gay, skirt, mama's boy, pussy whipped. And of course, we get now to the main one, which you might want to talk about. That's so gay. Meaning bad, dumb, stupid, and wrong. It's the generic bad thing. Let me say something here about a way that people often get confused. This is not about homophobia. This has nothing to do with gay men at all. This is about men who are aggressively identified with being heterosexual, having to prove it constantly to other men who are also aggressively heterosexual. They are homophobic, but the homophobia, as we see on the next page, 613, is toward themselves. They're afraid of the homosexual inside them, not of homosexuals out in the world. And of course it spills over there, but this is not what Kimmel's talking about. And in the Eminem quote at the bottom of 612, you see Eminem, the rapper, talking about how names that relate to gayness are used to put men down without even any regard to its sexual gender choice meaning. And again on the next page we get an idea of what it is for men in that section, gayness for men, but also an interesting quote if you've chosen to go over onto the area of how women are mixed up in all of this confusion, then you see that women themselves have a kind of reaction. I suspect he, any man, might be gay, she says, if he's looking at my eyes, not down my blouse. Another said she suspects he might be gay if he shows no sexual interest or if he doesn't immediately come on to her. Of course, not everybody acts like this, but large proportions of the population do, and we're working in an area where Kimmel has traveled around the country, interviewed many men and women, and come up with these conclusions. We accept provisionally that he's telling the truth. And the sixth quote here has to do with this phrase that he brings up, the negative playbook of Guyland. Avoid everything in it, you'll be all right. It's a list, a presumptive list, an imaginary list of all the things that you have to not do to prove you're not gay. Just make sure that you walk, talk, and act in a different way from the gay stereotype. Dress terribly, show no taste in art or music, show no emotions at all. Never listen to a thing a woman is saying, but express immediate and unquenchable sexual interest. Presto, you're a real man. As something I've heard said more than once is that men only have to know the names of 5 colors, so don't know what mauve and cerise and vermilion are, right? That's me talking, not Kimmel, but it fits. And again, toward the end of that paragraph, the idea that what's important to men, you could quote, is to offer constant proof that you are not gay, unquote. And then he talks about homophobia, and let's go on to the last page and see where all this goes. Last 2 pages. And we again see how it's not, again, about relating to homosexual men or to the gay movement or anything. It's about, 7th quote, homosexuality becomes a kind of shorthand for unmanliness. And the homophobia that defines and animates the daily conversation of Guyland is at least as much about masculinity as it is about sexuality. And here he tells again some interesting stories, and these are real stories, not generalizations, something that comes up in the exercise and you need to be aware of. Direct quotes from people who said it to Kimmel and about things that happened to them. And down here, pretty scarily in the middle of the page, we get men's reaction to these accusations of gayness and how in some cases violently they'd react to it. And all of this leads us to the very end where, let's read through this paragraph and let me go over it in some detail, because again it demonstrates the thesis that in your essay you're going to come out for or against. And again we understand that it's not talking about all men, but it's talking about a very prevalent stereotypical behavior among men that we want to be aware of if you want to understand this dynamic of male behavior and of male-female relationships, which it implies. The comments above provide a telling riposte. A riposte is a reaction in fencing where you block the enemy's thrust and strike back. To all those theories of biology that claim the definitions of masculinity, that this definition of masculinity is hardwired. That is, it's built into men's genetic makeup. The result of millennia of evolutionary adaptation or the behavioral response to waves of aggression producing testosterone, and therefore inevitable. What these theories fail to account for is the way that masculinity is coerced and policed relentlessly by other guys. That it's social, it's not biological. If it were biological, he concludes, it would be as natural as breathing or blinking. In truth, the guy code fits as comfortably as a straitjacket. You could quote that, but I must point out to you there's an error in it that lots of people make, but it's a real error. Straitjacket is not the opposite of a crooked jacket. It is a straight, like the straight of Hormuz, or the Straits of Gibraltar, Strait, meaning something that is narrow and rigid. It is not a straight IGHT jacket. But anyhow, his point is well made that the guy code doesn't fit men. And his point is that it's not biologically wired into them, but it is conditioned and maintained and perpetuated by peer pressure. And having summarized, maybe using those quotes, maybe using other ones, now would come the place where you talk about what you think of Kimmel's approach, how well he engaged you, all these rhetorical things that we're learning to become aware of. And finally, talk about whether you agree or disagree. And there's your essay, or at least the first draft of it. And we'll come back to how to do things like in-text citations in the next draft. But for now, I think you have plenty to do. Thank you for attention. This has been a long one, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Ungraded, unjudged, raw material out of which we're going to make your critical essay. Stay in touch.